Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our loose smut in barley update for 2023. If you don't know me, my name is Louise Fanning, and I'm joining from Watchabollock, Jadwa, Jadwa-Jarly, Regaya, and Jabbergook country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Please note that this presentation will be recorded, and we will send out a copy of the recording to all registered participants. We are also planning to upload this to Field Crop Diseases Victoria and make it available for anyone who has been unable to register for today's webinar. Today we will be covering the current loose smut in barley issue, the disease cycle, and most importantly, what the management options are. This will be followed by a Q&A session. Please note that the chat function has been enabled for this webinar, and you can type comments or questions before we get to the Q&A session as well. I'd now like to introduce our two speakers for today. Andrea is based in Western Australia, and she has a broad background in barley agronomy. She's also led the most recent research in barley loose smut in Australia as a result of some of the issues that they had in WA a few years ago. So she's one of the best experts in Australia to speak on this topic. Harry is based in Victoria with Agriculture Victoria and currently manages the cereal disease program. He also has a very broad background in cereal diseases, including foliar diseases of wheat, barley, and oats. So I'd now like to hand over to Andrea and Harry to kick off with an update on the current loose smut situation.
Thanks, Louise. I'll start the presentation first, discussing about the life cycle, and then hand over to Andrea about the management strategies. Yeah, hello all. Good evening, everyone in Victoria and other parts. Good afternoon. I just want to start with what we have seen in 2023 season, and then discuss about the life cycle of the loose smut. What we have seen in 2023 is more than usual appearance of smut, especially in most of the paddocks across Victoria. And I hear from other pathologists across New South Wales as well to have seen some level of smuts. And Andrea will explain about Western Australian conditions. What was the reason that we have seen smut in 2023? So this relates to the conditions not in 2023, but actually the conditions that we had in 2022. For smut, for many of you would be aware of how bad was 2022 in terms of disease. We had really good conditions which are really conducive, such as cold and rainy season, rainy spring season especially, which means the temperatures are around 10 to 20 degrees centigrade, which really helps smut development and transmission. So that's what we have seen in 2022. There was infection in the crops, and which carried into the next season, that is 2023. And the other important reason why we see smuts in barley is some of the varieties that we grow have susceptibility to smut, which means if you're growing a susceptible variety, so then there is an obvious chance that you might see smuts in the following season. To name some of the varieties that we have seen in smut this season, historically, we know that Hindmarsh family of varieties exhibit susceptibility to loose smut, and to name a few from Hindmarsh family: Lothrop, Rosalind, Maxima CL, and Spartacus CL, and Cyclops. We have seen smut in this brand of varieties. And apart from that, we also have seen in a number of other varieties such as Beast, Leapbrook, Yeti, Leprose, Scope, Buff, and Commodus. The list is very long. I also encourage audience to use the chat box to enter the name of the varieties that they have seen in any of the other varieties that apart from this list. So this will help us to understand the prevalence levels of this smut in 2023 and also understand the risk for 2024. Now moving on to the symptoms of smut. So the pictures that are shown in the slide are of loose smut. So loose smut is one of those diseases which is very easy to identify. As soon as you see black heads, especially in your paddock, so that either signifies to be loose smut or covered smut. For loose smut, the symptoms look very powdery. The heads look very powdery and also replaced by black spores, as shown in the figure. So these smuts actually have a thin membrane, and this can be broken very easily with a small amount of pressure, and then these heads release a lot of spores. And with the wind, these spores actually blow onto the new crops, new healthy plants, and leaving a bare rachis or head that we can see on the third picture. So, which means all the spores have been now moved on to the new crop, and the infection restarts into the new plants. This is about loose smut, how it looks like, and now I'll show you covered smut. Covered smut is a bit slightly different. It has it looks like black head as well again, but the difference is it has a thicker and harder membrane, which helps to keep the head intact. And this will be broken whenever there's more amount of pressure applied. So for suppose during the harvesting process, when the equipment comes in contact with these heads, they generally break the head, and which means there's obvious release of spores, and that can infect the new grain when it comes to when the spores come into contact. So that is the obvious difference between the two smuts. Now we'll look into disease life cycle of the loose smut. Loose smut, to start with, loose smut is most often observed during the flowering season, or when the heads come out. And some of loose smut heads generally come earlier than the healthy plant heads, which means there's more amount of inoculum to spread as well. So that's another reason why we generally see little earlier appearance of loose smut. And these, once you see the loose smut, the spores obviously with the wind, they carry into the other plants, surrounding plants, which are healthy plants, and they get infected. The florets, they get infected, and the infection process actually starts from there. And to know how much time the florets or the heads are infective, so it is actually spans around 10 to 15 days. So until after 1 week after the pollination period, the heads tend to be more vulnerable for the infection. And if the conditions are really suitable, as we had in 2022, especially rainfall during this particular period, then the spores actually germinate and produce mycelium in the seed. And this mycelium actually stays there, and once the seed is harvested, it just stays into dormant stage until we sow that seed in the next season. And as you can see in the picture, we can't really identify these symptoms in the seed that we have harvested. So the symptoms actually are not visible at that stage, and that's how the infection is generally carried into the new season. Once this infected seed is sown, the fungus actually grows with the plant, especially at the growing point, and replace the head with black spore mass. And then once the heads are out, we'll see just the loose and powdery spores, indicating the infection has happened in the last season. As I said, the heads generally come out a little early than the healthy plants, so which provides an opportunity for the loose smut to have more inoculum and spread other growing heads. There is a slight difference between in terms of life cycle between loose smut and covered smut. So loose smut, as I said, it infects the seed and actually generally grows inside the seed, whereas covered smut, it is sort of external. It is seed-borne disease, but it actually stays on the external side of the seed, on the seed coat. And also it can survive in soil as well. So it has dual mode of infection, so as seed or soil-borne. Moving on to the differences between how the healthy embryo looks like and the infected embryo looks like. This is a really nice piece of picture that is provided by Andrea. The healthy embryo, as you can see, it is very clean and healthy, whereas the infected embryo, you can see that the blue mass, especially surrounding the embryo, is actually the mycelium of the disease. And what we really don't know is when it is not symptomatic, which means we can't really see on the top of the seed, and the mycelium just stays in dormant stage. And as soon as we sow the seed, it just grows with the plant. And yeah, the first symptom that we can see is once the heads are out. And that is why it is a little bit troublesome to manage the disease, especially if you have found loose smut in the crop. Now I will wrap my talk with what it is for 2024 season. So what we have seen in 2023, there's so much of inoculum, especially with a lot of varieties have been infected with loose smut. This means there's conditions that are really suitable for spore dispersal, especially with winds, a lot of winds. It was dry spring, to be honest, and that's then comes whether the conditions are really conducive for the infections to happen. We have conditions suitable for spore dispersal, but whether the conditions were really conducive for the infections. I should say, yeah, as I said, yeah, we have 2023 sort of looking like a dry spring with clear skies and mostly, humid, mostly dry weather. So this means the germinations may not really happen as good as what happened in 2022, and the infection levels slightly can be less compared to 2023 season. But irrespective of whatever it is, we have a lot of inoculum, so which means we need to manage this disease at any point of time. And with that, I'll hand over to Andrea to talk about what are the management strategies that we can look into controlling this disease. Over to you, Andrea.
Beautiful. Thanks. Okay, so Harry's gone through how seasonal conditions can influence loose smut infections, but the other aspect he also mentioned was variety. So when we look at variety susceptibility to loose smut, it's no different to all the other diseases in that varieties vary, and we know that high marsh or dash is susceptible. This schematic I've just put up here shows the relationship between the varieties in the very popular high marsh family, and under their name of each variety, I've just put their pedigree or their parentage, so you can see how they relate to one another. We haven't had a chance to test Maximus in the field directly against other varieties, so we don't know if it's as susceptible as other varieties or any of the other newer varieties, but we can infer from knowing Maximus pedigree that it's possibly susceptible, similar to others. So we have done trials in the past looking at and assessing variety susceptibility. We, for instance, sowed over a dozen varieties in a trial with infected seed, and the strips of infected seed are uniformly throughout the trial. We also go back and sow more infected seed in a week or two later, so that the later maturing varieties that are being assessed also are exposed to a high number of loose smut spores. And from our assessments, when we grew them out the following spring, what we found is that this group of varieties are quite up the top, are quite high in loose smut levels, and then towards the bottom of the table we found Compass and Planet were less affected. Ooh, going forward. What's going on? So, whoops. So what we managing loose smut, I've jumped a couple. Sorry, guys, girls. Managing loose smut, basically, as Harry went through the life cycle, we are basically preventing the expression of seed that is already infected by using seed dressings. And that is, by and large, the simplest way to do it. So what you can see here is another wonderful photo of loose smut in this bright colour that has grown from the infected embryo. and colonise this growing point. And this is exactly what seed dressings will prevent. Even though the embryo is infected, it'll prevent it growing into these seed growing points, because this will stay here as the plant develops, even as it puts out on tillers. And if we haven't got it, you can see here in the embryonic head, the loose smut fungus grows into that as well. And where we would generally get little florets developing and all their associated structures, flowers, awns, it gets replaced with those dark brown spore masses that emerge in spring. So, seed efficacy trials. DPIRD did a series of these 5 years ago, and when we last had very bad loose smut, and we looked at a range of seed dressings, and we looked at their registered rates for smut control. So you can see on the far right-hand corner the litres per tonne of seed that we applied. So take note that for the two products, Evergold Energy and Rancona Dimension, they have a much higher rate on their labels for root disease control, but we use the slower rate just for smut control. And you'll also notice that most of the products are either a DMI, a group 3, or an SDHI, a group 7, or possibly a mix of both of these. So seed untreated plots of our treated seed were really heavily infected. When we looked at in spring of the untreated plots, and we could see that, you know, there's anything from 4 to 17 plants per metre squared infected. And the range and values is quite normal for smut, and it's due to Katanning, which had having quite a relatively dry season that year. So there's not only variation in sort of levels of infection, there are just natural variations in level of expression that year in the following year as well. But we were pretty happy with the amount of smut we had, and the results of the seed dressing efficacy is that all the registered products reduce loose smut, but some are definitely better at it. So the letters here next to the numbers indicate the different levels of effectiveness between products, but the top 4 had just about nearly 100% control of loose smut. And the thing to note about those top 4 is that they all contain an SDHI or group 7 fungicide in them. The others still did a good job, but not quite in that league. And it was interesting that there was, despite the difference in levels of smut expression over the 3 sites, the order of performance was nearly identical across all of them, and the level of performance. So seed dressing summary, I'd really recommend, if you're going to do it yourself, that you clean the seed before application, or because dust with its quite a high level of surface area just sucks in all that liquid. You're wasting your dressing and reducing the efficacy of what you're trying to do. If you do it yourself, keep your water rates fairly high. With sound seed and low grain moisture, you can use up to 8 litres of liquid per tonne, and don't overload augers while you're doing it. Once it's treated, try not to move the treated grain around too much, because it will rub and can abrade the product off. But if you have got heavily infected seed, you also need to keep your expectations fairly moderate, because you probably will still get a few escapes, even if you're using a really good product. It's just the nature of the beast. We looked at other management approaches, and the traditional one is seed testing and replacement if you've got around 5% or more infection. You can contact your local crop health laboratory, and they should be able to test your seed for barley loose smut. And don't forget to get the seed that you're potentially replacing it with tested as well, because even if they didn't see any this year or much in the crop this year, you know, inoculum spores could have flown in from a really nasty crop next door. You won't know until you test. So my colleague Keith Jayasena also looked at preventing infection, and he found that one really well-timed application of tebuconazole at head emergence onto the primary tillers can reduce the level of loose smut in seed. So we're only recommending this for seed crops because there are fungicide resistance concerns around using tebuconazole as a product by itself. And I'd also stress that your timing needs to be pretty good. You don't want it too late. If the anthers are out, I would say the horse is bolted. You want it so that, yeah, at 59, so those heads have just emerged. We also investigated the effect of seed size on levels of loose smut infection. So what we did is we had 3 varieties that with various levels of loose smut in them, and we graded them into 3 groups roughly. And then we grew out each of these groups to see how much smut was in them. And what we found was there's definitely a trend towards higher levels of smut in the screenings, or the fraction that was less than 2.2 millimetres. And keeping seed size high did sort of significantly help the high marsh seed. So it won't completely remove the problem or anything, but it could help reduce it. So, I mean, your growers are probably already grading anyway, or I hope, but definitely, yep, do it. It can might give you the edge. Haven't really mentioned yield and don't really want to dwell on it, but it is proportional to the percentage of plants affected, and plenty of work overseas echoes this. We had significant relationships in most of our trials. The average penalty is actually just over 1%, but that's, yeah, well, yeah, which is probably what you'd expect, really. So loose smut, in summary, the good news is that it does look worse than it is. If you go out next spring, you've treated and graded your seed, or you've graded your seed and cleaned it first, and then you've treated it. Go out in spring, have a look. If you can mark out, or, you know, and count the number of infected plants in a 10 by 10 metre square, I think you'll get a pleasant surprise, because in that square, depending on your seeding rate, there'll be anywhere from 12,000 to 15,000 plants, and you can start to put into context the level of infection you're looking at. So you can take heart from the fact that you're probably not looking at a severe yield penalty. It's a horrible looking disease, but you don't need a lot of inoculum under conducive infections to suddenly get you know, an outbreak, as we've seen from last year. But it can be controlled, it can be managed, and I would say that for the more susceptible varieties, it is useful, if you don't like looking at it and you're in the medium to high rainfall areas, that you do treat those varieties consistently each year. So thank you very much. That's where I'll leave it. Back to you, Louise.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Harry. What we might do now is open up for any questions that anyone had. If you want to type any questions you have into the chat, or even raise your hand if you'd prefer you to ask your question through a microphone, I can then unmute you. I suppose the question that I'd have, Andrew, is if you've got a grower, at what sort of infection level would you be looking at a crop and going, it needs to be, well, other than the 5%, but if you're out there in the field and want to keep it for seed for the next year and you're considering that foliar fungicide application, what might be some trigger points?
Basically, the trigger point for trying to prevent infection, I think, is whether or not you have a susceptible variety. Whether it has been quite a nice cool spring and you've noticed, you know, you have got heads, there are heads around you. So this year, even though it wasn't a cool, you know, a good spring for transmission, but as Harry sort of pointed out, we had just such high levels of inoculum that we probably will get a bit of infection, hopefully not as bad as this year, but still a bit more infection, just ticking along in the susceptible varieties and the others. So that, yeah, it depends on your tolerance to looking at it. It's something you can't estimate the severity in the spring before that you'll get. I've had growers say, oh, you know, my crop's just rotten. It's, you know, it must be 20% infected, 20%. And then we've done embryo tests and it has come back, you know, it's way less than that. It's, you know, 4%, something like that. So it can look very dramatic, but until you get the harvested grain and test it, you don't know. So, yeah, protecting seed, that's the other reason why it's a preventative thing and we recommend it for seed because, you know, it's not, you can't prevent a yield loss because you've already had it expressed. So it's just more suited to a smaller area.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat and I've just had someone raise their hand. So I'm just going to unmute Michael.
Hi, can you hear me?
Can ask you. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Mike Davies from Department of Primary Industries, also in WA. Just a question for the panel. We have historically had in our seed certification rules, only in Western Australia, a standard for loose and covered smuts at 0.05%, being a visual standard where we would count tillers and if it was above that, we would not accept it for certification. This is before my time, Andrea, but certainly something that's being questioned at this stage. So I guess my question is twofold. One, is a visual standard, is a standard for seed production likely to be an effective measure of control for future seasons? And if so, is that standard reasonable, too tight? Is it possible to relax that, given that any other standards internationally might be slightly more relaxed than that? Thanks.
I would say it's very difficult. I think the standard gives growers a degree of confidence in what they're buying. However, having said that, it is, it's difficult to have a visual standard when you don't know or you can't control what's happening around you. So you can't really comment on the embryo transmission that you may have, you know, the true amount of infected seed that you actually have. I think it's better than nothing, but
Do you think it, sorry, just to follow up then, do you think would be more worthwhile leaning towards a laboratory test? How readily accessible and affordable are the laboratory tests for infection, and would it be worth just switching more to that as an effective standard?
I think most, I can see value in it, but it isn't cheap. I think they're around $500 in WA, and obviously it's only as good as the representative sampling that's done of the seed lot. It's very labour intensive process for assessing it. Look, I think I'm not so hung up on it in terms of trying to sort of prevent it, because sometimes I think in some seasons it'll be very difficult to source seed that is under a certain level because of the prevalence of the inoculum. So I think using a seed dressing is probably about the best you can do, whether it's a professional contractor or yourself. It may take a year or two, but you can definitely get it back under control.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Following on from that, we've got a question here asking, do you recommend seed testing for loose smut?
Sorry, what testing?
Do you recommend seed testing?
No. Look, it really depends on your risk outlook. If you are really worried about the level of infection in your seed, how severe it is, I think you should be using a seed dressing anyway. And there are plenty of options, even in the SDHIs. Things like carboxin are not expensive. And seed testing is good, I suppose, to let you know where you stand. But really, if you're using a seed dressing most years, you don't need to worry about it. It just removes it from the equation.
This next one is probably aimed at both of you. What do you think the risk is likely to be next year, given that it's looking drier?
Harry, you got your crystal ball there?
Yep. Yeah, as I said earlier, I think this year we had conditions which are suitable for spore dispersal. But the thing is, the conditions were not really great for infection to happen in the healthy plants. So I think like the risk will be less going into the next season. But having said that, there is more inoculum than what we generally see in a normal year. In that sense, I would expect that there will be some infection. But if you have your seed dressing, I think we have a lot of seed dressings that are available, as Andy has shown. So if you use any of that, I think you will be well covered in terms of risk levels. So we don't really see loose smut in next season. And again, having said that, we know what are the susceptible varieties for a start, especially Hindmarsh, a group of varieties, and taking a bit of care for them, I think will be useful.
Thanks for that, Harry. And it wouldn't be a webinar about fungal diseases if we didn't have a question about fungicide resistance. So we've got a question here. Is there any chance of resistance developing to the SDHI?
The risk is, the SDHIs themselves, as a rule, are sort of medium to high level resistance levels, risks. Loose smut, I think the amount of seed that moves around the country, that there's probably a lot of crossing, I would have thought, going around. Certainly I did tests on different sources of loose smut, looking at whether it may have developed resistance against carboxin, the older SDHI, and it was effective at even 50% of the registered rate. So there wasn't any sign a few years ago of resistance. It's something that would be useful to keep our eye out for, but it is a tricky issue because, application is just such a critical part of getting good seed treatment, getting it to be effective. And you may think you've had a reasonable sort of application, but get a nasty surprise later in the season when it's not actually the seed, the product's fault.
Okay, that's the last of the questions that I've got in the chat, and no one else has got their hands raised. So with that, I'd like to thank Andrea and Harry for presenting today. I'd also like to say thank you all for attending today's webinar. I've put a link to a brief evaluation in the chat, and we would be very grateful if you could take the time to fill it in. For further information, you can visit the DPIRD website or Field Crop Diseases Victoria. You can Google either of those and then you'll get access to the information. If you require assistance with diagnosing loose smut symptoms, you can use the My Pest Guide Reporter tool if you're in Western Australia, so you can send in photos through that, or you can contact CropSafe if you're located in Victoria. So once again, thank you all for attending, and please remember to fill out the evaluation.
Thank you. Thanks for your comments too.
Thank you.